Hey everybody, Cybertao back with you. We're going to continue our examination of hanging pawns. We're continuing to look at the b-pawn break against hanging pawns. There's a little bit less content here in terms of instructional value, just because I think most of these positions tend to be much more tactical. It tends to be a bit more of a permanent pawn sacrifice, so there's less generalities you can draw from it, and it's more concrete calculation, which really doesn't lend itself terribly well to examination. But we're going to look at another example today. This is a bit more of a static blockade. This will be sort of another cautionary tale of the dangers of just taking a passive blockading stance against the hanging pawns, because that comes with its own set of risks. But this is the game Ojanen against Trifunovic in 1953. D4. 6 should be 4. So the Nimzo Indian, just for 80 years running now, one of the most popular openings in chess. I love how it combines soundness with activity, plus modern theory really hasn't built upon it humongously. Opening theory really only takes roots in a deadly fashion in really super concrete and tactical openings, so you look next door to its neighbors, the Grunfeld and the King's Indian defense. Those are just replete with modern opening theory up to move 30, 35 in some cases, especially with the Grunfeld. Nimzo, much more open-ended because the positions are much more quiet and positional, so they don't lend themselves to computer preparation as much. So I switched to the Nimzo Indian 10 years ago, and I've been perfectly happy ever since. I used to play the Grunfeld, but it's just way too much work at the moment. E3, this is the Rubinstein. This is, I would say, the most straightforward and sound way of responding against the Nimzo Indian. A few other options. Queen c2 is the second most popular option. At some point it was the first most popular, but that sort of switched back around. White's fighting for the e4 square and preventing the double pawns. Downside, you're spending a move on a queen move on move 4, which typically isn't sound. Knight f3. This is a very fluid modern option. Basically, white keeps all of his options open. He can still play queen c2. He can play e3 to go back into a Rubinstein. Or he can play a bit more of a modern system with g3. All those options are still open to white. And then f3. This is sometimes called the Kamach. Usually just called the f3. This is the most theoretical line in modern chess. Just because it lends itself to computer preparation, because it tends to be very tactical and concrete. A lot of times this will transpose to some lines of the same-ish variation. The same-ish is A3. And this is a very old-fashioned way of facing the Nimzo. Basically, white forces the double pawns immediately. Theoretically, it improves white's flexibility, just because you can arrange his pieces directly in response to the double pawns. Usually white doesn't play this move forward anymore. He plays f3, which is typically more flexible. Spending a3 to do what black is thinking about doing anyways is sort of a waste of time. At least in the eyes of modern chess. But e3 was played, that's the most flexible move in my opinion. Castles. And f3, d5, a3. So this is a delayed samish. And this is actually a little bit more dangerous here because black has played d5. That ensures that the double c-pawns will come off the board more or less immediately. So now, if black doesn't do anything, white can just take on d5 and play bishop d3, and there's no double c-pawns on the board for white to take advantage of. The downside, of course, white's still spending that tempo with a3, and just because the doubled c-pawns go away doesn't mean the weakness goes away. A lot of times, black will still have a very weak square in c4 to attack and occupy. Just because there's no longer a pawn there doesn't mean that the weaknesses no longer exist there. Black plays c5. Very logical. Basically, the white king is still in the center. White has those central weaknesses, so black starts to rip open the position and go after them. cx d5. This is completely illogical. This is just accelerating black's development at a time when white's behind the development. Normal move is just to lose the tempo. This is the main line of the delayed samish. This is considered perfectly fine for black, but this is definitely a fight. So white has a bishop pair. In return, black has very smooth developments and he has that weakness on c4 that he can seek to occupy with either a knight after knight c6 to a5, or a bishop with bishop a6 takes and then bishop c4. Bishop e2 is an interesting move. I've given notes on this in the game notes that you can look at as usual. It is an interesting move. I don't necessarily think it's better or worse for white, just interesting. But taking a d5 is absolutely illogical. Knight takes. This is simply bad. E takes is simply much better. It immediately opens up a line of attack for this bishop on c8. Now, this bishop was a bad bishop, but now after taking an d5 with the pawn, this bishop is extraordinarily strong, just because it is a very easy place to go to. c4 is more or less forced. If bishop d3, this allows black to just get an incredible grip in the position. Black is immediately better after this. So c4 is almost forced. And black is very comfortable. Black's at least equal here. Black has very easy development. The white king still isn't castled. White has the bishop pair, but that's very easily outweighed by black's mobilization, in my opinion. But taking a d5 is simply wrong. So white just kicks the knight away. Queen c2, this isn't good. White has a very comfortable position here. And this is a good example of when hanging pawns are very favorable. White has the bishop pair. The bishop pair is perfectly lined up behind the hanging pawns. That's the sort of coordination you want to see when you have hanging pawns, because you want your pieces to be as active as possible. Queen c2, there's no reason to be moving the queen so early. It potentially exposes the queen to tempo loss later. Black takes. Bishop d7, this is a little bit inaccurate, plus the idea behind it, in my opinion, is inaccurate. b6 is just more straightforward and better. Knight c6, this is a key move to underline. Knight bd7 looks pretty, but the knight doesn't have anywhere to go. These two knights sort of step on one another's toes. The nice part about going to c6 is that this knight can actually go to a5 to attack the c-pawn, and that's often a very standard maneuver in hanging pawns to try to gain pressure at the hanging pawns. So when you're developing against the hanging pawns, be careful where you put that queen knight, because oftentimes you want to put it on a place like a5, or if you're playing with white, a4, to attack the hanging pawns. When it's on d7 in this position, the knight really has nowhere to go, and has no way to gain pressure on the hanging pawns. Sort of leaves white in the driver's seat just because these pawns can't be pressured. But after castle, this is a balanced position in my opinion. White's got the bishop pair. They're not the most active because this bishop's not on d3, but that can be rectified quickly. But because the knight's on c6, the knight can quickly hop to something like a5 to gain pressure on the hanging pawns. This is a balanced position, where after bishop d7, it's just not a very good diagonal for the bishop. Bishop e2, b5. So this is another example of when you go back to the older instructional books. A move like this is praise is heaped upon the move immediately. And from this point on, the rest of the game is just sort of given as a logical construct from this initial moment, whereas nothing could be further from the truth. This is actually a bad choice from black, and it just gives white some useful trumps to work with. Better we just be bishop c6. Trade. Hitting that pawn on d4, so bishop c6 is forced. This is a little bit of an edge for whites. Nothing drastic, but I do think white's slightly for choice here. It's better for white than the previous note. Whereas after b5, so the idea is, if the pawn takes, just bishop takes. Give that a question mark, because it's a bad move. This is simply much better for black. Black's going to recover the piece. White will have that isolated queen pawn with no compensation for it. But after c5, the idea is that in a position like this, that these hanging pawns are blockaded, and that blockade is worth anything. Let's be clear, a blockade is by definition a passive thing. You're blockading the pawns to prevent them from moving, but that's not an active achievement, that's a passive achievement. Just like a knight outpost or something else, it needs to be achieving something else. It's not an end in itself. It has to be a means to another end. The blockade in and of itself is not an achievement. You need to be achieving something from that achievement. Whereas by forcing c5, this is a trump for white. This is a pass c pawn. It is absolutely worth something. It's taking up valuable squares. You know, black can't put anything on d6. That's worth something. White still has the bishop pair. The bishop pair is always worth something, basically in virtually any position. This is just a better position for white. Now, white immediately goes astray. Queen c3 is an immediate error. Queen b2 is simply better. Just some quick and easy moves. White has a serious advantage. White has the bishop pair. That's always worth something. He has this pass c pawn. That's absolutely a trump. And he has good pressure against that b pawn. And that was an immediate result from this decision here. You know, b5 created this blockade, but it also stuck this pawn out here where it's a potential weakness. In a position like this, that pawn's already under fire. White has a serious advantage in this position. Now, queen c3 immediately gives it all away by exposing the queen. Bishop e3 is more drift. Queen b2 is better, just taking the tempo loss. And this is a good example of a deadlock game. Again, the blockade is not an achievement in itself. The blockade needs to be achieving something. It needs to be. It's a means to an end. If it's not achieving something, it's just a passive achievement. It stops play, but it doesn't achieve play in itself. Always remember, you need to be finding active play for yourself. If you're not finding active play, by definition, you're not going to be winning. A passive blockade of the hanging pawns is something, but it's not an end in itself. It's a means to an end, hopefully. This position is completely deadlocked. There's no way for either side really to make progress here. No. Black has this ironclad blockade, but he can't gain any active play of his own. But bishop e3 just continues the drift. Knight d5. So this is a good example of when a blockade is actually leading to an advantage. So black has this ironclad blockade of the hanging pawns. He has this very active bishop on e4. That's good. But the main thing is, he has these mobile pawns of his own. He has active play. So he has his own threat of a5 and b4, pushing his pass b pawn, whereas this pass c pawn can't make a similar achievement. That's why black is better here. Not just because of the blockade, but because black has active play to go along with the blockade. Again, the initial achievement, which really wasn't an achievement, because it's, you know, this is better for white, but the initial achievement of the light square blockade of the hanging pawns isn't an end in itself. It's a means to an end. So the older instructional books, when they say that the blockade of the hanging pawns, what you should be looking for, in my opinion, is just completely incorrect. You want to be winning those pawns or generating active play of your own. Just simply blockading the hanging pawns should only be a partial step in something else. But this particular position, this is better for black, just because black has active pieces plus this mobile b pawn to go with it. Knight e5, there's another way, rook e1. I'll just show a quick line. White has some play, but this is just an extra pawn for white. Knight e5, queen c7 is a huge error. Just simply take. And black has a humongous edge. You know, he has this super strong knight on d5. He has this mobile b pawn. Again, that's the key to the position. Usually the key to a position for activity is you have your own pawn break. Black has this pawn break b4 and this strong pass pawn that can shoot down the board really quickly. That's why black is better. Not necessarily just because he had that blockade. But queen c7 is just an error. Queen d2, that gives it all back away, and that's just a very simple tactical error. Simply f3. Knight takes. And black doesn't work here, worse here, but again, this is just a passive blockade. It doesn't achieve anything active. This is dead equal. Just because that bishop is blunted out, so what black has is just a passive blockade of these hanging pawns. Without active play, he still has that b pawn, but that's it. He no longer has a strong knight on d5 to back that up. This is dead equal. Whereas after queen d2, of course, just overlooks an easy tactic. The rest of the game can go by quickly. I'll show the rest, just for completion's sake. If you want to see a few more details, the game note shows that. But the rest is pretty straightforward. That's a huge mistake. E5, breaking open the position. And white resigned, black's up 2 pawns here. F5, E4. Just game's completely over. But really, the area to focus on, and this is the big myth that I want to continue to dispel. I've talked about some of the blockading stuff in the older analysis early in our session, but this moment here where black is shooting for this blockade. The blockade, again, I can't say enough, the blockade is not an end in itself. This initial achievement of blockading the hanging pawns, it's not enough. It's not an end in itself. It's not a good in itself. Here, in fact, I would say black is worse because this passed c pawn is an achievement. That bishop pair is an achievement. White's edge in space is an achievement, and the fact that these hanging pawns aren't mobile, again, it's not an end in itself. At best, it's a means to an end, where it's accomplishing something on the way. This is simply a better position for white, and if white had played correctly, white has the asset of the bishop pair. White has the asset of the strong passed c-pawn. After that b-pawn push, white is achieving pressure against that b-pawn. Those are real assets that white can hang his hat on. It's why white is better in this position. Simply going for the blockade of the hanging pawns isn't enough. In fact, you really would rather be going for a position like this, where your goal is to achieve pressure on the pawns. It's much better to attack than just passively blockade. Black has active plans here. You can play knight a5, rook c8, queen c7. Go after that c-pawn in the hanging pawn duo. That's exactly what you want to be doing. You don't just want to be looking to passive blockade of the position. So I really wanted to give this game because it's part of a myth that I see in older instructional books, especially, where the blockade of the hanging pawns is the goal. And that's just not true. It's a means to an end at best. Ideally, the blockade leads to pressure or some other objective on another part of the board. But if the blockade is just for the point of the blockade, which is what we see here, then it's often worse than useless. It's just giving the side with the hanging pawn some sort of asset, like a passed pawn, extra space, what have you. The fact that black won this is really just due to factors completely unrelated to the initial decision to form that blockade with b5. So when you're playing against the hanging pawns, just keep in mind a nice-looking blockade like this is not the end in itself. At best, it's a means to an end. But ideally, you're generating pressure against the hanging pawns. Or if you are blockading, that's giving you some other achievement that you can actually hang your hat on. So short game, but I think it's an important myth to dispel. We're going to continue looking at the b-pawn break in our next session. So my name is John. I'll see you then.